Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session as part of the Festival of Ideas at York. The session is entitled Performing Intimacy, Conversations and Relationships in a World of Social Media. And by way of introduction, my name is Darren Reed from the Sociology Department. I will be chairing and facilitating this session. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Just as a little bit of background, my expertise is as a conversation analyst, meaning that I'm a social scientist who studies, people often get fearful in my presence, studies conversation in everyday life. And that also includes the way that people use their body in interaction. So it was a real pleasure when I was invited to chair the session. And so we have two, in some senses similar, but in other ways dissimilar members of our panel today. And what I'm hoping we're going to do is generate an interesting conversation about conversation, perhaps across the ideas of good conversation, perhaps more traditional notions of conversation, and in relation to contemporary formats. And that's, of course, conveyed in the title, which talks about social media. I should say that I teach classes on social media in the sociology department. So I'm sure I'm going to enjoy this session. I hope you will too. By way of introduction, let me speak briefly to our panelists today. Emily Hund studies social media influencers, and her book, The Influencer Industry, The Quest for Authenticity on Social Media, tracks the development of the influencer phenomenon from a haphazard group of people scrambling for work to today's multifaceted industry with expanding global impact. Currently, she is a research affiliate with the Center on Digital Culture and Society at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication. So welcome, Emily. Secondly, we have Paula Marantz Cohen. Paula Marantz Cohen is Distinguished Professor of English and Dean of the Pennoni Honors College at Drexel University in Philadelphia. There's much to be said, but she is author of 5 non-fiction books on literature, film, art, and culture, and 5 novels, including her most recent book, Talking Cure, an essay on the civilizing power of conversation. And it's that book, in a sense, that we will be discussing today. And the format of the day, or the next hour or so, I should say, is that I will invite the panel members to introduce their own books and perhaps reflect on the other's book. We then have an opportunity for about half an hour to have a conversation, perhaps between the 3 of us. We'll see how that goes. I may well prompt some conversational points. And then from around half an hour in, I do invite you to put your questions on the Q&A section, and I will feed those questions into our conversation. So maybe we start with Emily, if that's okay. Welcome, Emily. Thank you very much for taking part in this panel. And I just invite you to tell us about your book and perhaps also kind of reflect on Paula's book as well.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me here. Again, my name is Emily Hund. I am the author of the book, The Influencer Industry, The Quest for Authenticity on Social Media. And this book came out of a many years long path of working in media and then leaving intentionally to study it and understand how the rise of digital creators and influencers was reshaping the production of culture. And over the years, of course, the influencer industry has expanded tremendously to the point that it has, become deeply rooted in our ways of life and our ways of interacting with the world, the way culture, broadly speaking, information goods and services are conceived of, marketed, and sold to us have all been impacted by the development of this industry. And the central argument of my book is that the influencer industry in its growth and development has made possible the industrialization of authenticity. So by this, I mean that authenticity is, of course, the commodity that this multi-billion-dollar industry trades on. Influencers are afforded visibility, brand deals, greater reach based on, the evaluations by brands and social media companies and their audiences of how authentic they seem to be. And so the growth of this industry has also brought with it a sort of detachment of authenticity from meanings that we have historically given to authenticity. So things like being genuine, being honest, perhaps being spontaneous, these sorts of things. So instead, people's authenticity is judged by how well they perform it within the boundaries of this commercial enterprise. So it's shaped by the tools available at any given time. And so in my book, I trace the sort of trajectory from the rise of blogging and the more text-based presentation of self in the early 21st century through to Instagram, and then now we're in sort of the age of TikTok. And so authenticity looks different in these different times. How well are people performing it within the confines of a TikTok video or an Instagram story or an Instagram post, using a trending filter, these sorts of things. The industrial version of authenticity is also, of course, shaped by changing cultural and political norms. And most critically, it's underpinned by economic uncertainty. So this whole influencer enterprise really hinges on this mythical idea that fashioning yourself as an influencer is a way toward professional and creative fulfillment today, or that by following and engaging with influencers, that's the way to sort of find community or find answers to your questions and that sort of thing. And that's not to say that people can never do that, that they can't ever find community or ever find, information that they're looking for, because people do, of course. But it brings up a lot of questions, I think, about the nature of authenticity and intimacy in the digital age, and where the limits are, or the boundaries for the sort of life-giving nature of conversation that Paula describes so well in her book. Paula talks a lot about, of course, the sort of magic that can happen in an in-person interaction, and the way that people, how conversation can be sort of life-affirming and also sort of a balm for our loneliness and things like that. And we've all experienced that, I think, in the in-person context. And some people do experience it to various degrees in the social media context as well. But I think we can all agree that perhaps there's a different texture to it. And so I'm looking forward to exploring these questions in our conversation today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily, and so much to kind of think about in relation to your work on. I'll come back with some questions later. That's all right.
Sure.
So may I hand over to Professor Cohen? I promise to call you Paula from now on. And maybe tell us about your book in relation to your motivation in writing it. It's a very, in and of itself, it feels like a very comforting book. It's a lovely book to read and feel incorporated into these moments of conversation. So maybe you could just kind of start there and tell us what you were wanting to hear from your book.
I guess the book was perhaps a response to the COVID situation, where I felt particularly isolated and depressed, actually, I realized how much I depend on serendipitous conversation to lift my spirits and keep me in the world, so to speak. Even though I was on Zoom a great deal, and as we'll discuss, there are moments on Zoom that have been extremely gratifying. And as Emily said, it's not an entirely negative situation. Social media has many positives, but the spontaneity and the feeling of surprise that one gets in face-to-face conversation is something that I realize that I thrive on. I guess that makes me an extrovert. I need it for my mental health. And so I try to explore both personally and more historically where conversation has served to support creativity in various groups throughout history, for example, where groups would get together and talk and then result in some sort of creative movement, as well as my own personal involvement with conversation in different contexts. For example, right after college, I spent a year in France, and I feel that that certainly helped my ability to converse well. And what goes along with speaking not fluently, but well enough in another language, and how valuable that can be in being both inside and outside of a culture. And I also discussed what my favorite thing is, which is eating, drinking, and conversing with friends or acquaintances. How does food and drink help facilitate rational intercourse, as Virginia Woolf put it? And bad conversation, what makes bad conversation, why certain people or certain kinds of tics of personality do not lend themselves to that kind of engagement. And I guess if I were to think about what Emily is talking about and what I am talking about, it has to do with, I suppose, the feeling of losing oneself, whereas she's talking about a certain kind of performance. I think really good conversation doesn't, obviously there's always some degree of performance when you're interacting with another person, but ideally you lose yourself in the joy of connectivity with another person. And I really feel that's something that if you've experienced it, whether with individuals or with a class, because I also talk about it in a seminar, it's such an exhilarating experience that I think we don't want to do without it, and we want to find ways to make sure that we have it in our lives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I wonder if there's anything from, you'd like to respond to each other in any way. If there are particular points that you'd like to make. We're all being very agreeable at the moment, and I think a good conversation has got to have a little bit of disagreement.
Has a little edge to it.
Little edge to it.
Yes.
That's a little frisson.
But we're all very nice people. We don't know each other very well, so it's hard to have edge.
I think we're having a lovely conversation already, and people are invited to watch that conversation. So, I mean, we could talk about voyeurism if you really wanted. But anyway, firstly, I wanted to ask you, I mean, points of agreement, that's all very nice. But what about difficulties going forward? Is there anything that you each would like to say about that? Maybe Emily. Well,
Emily.
oh, okay.
No, I was going to ask Emily if difficulties going forward in what sense?
Well, I just mean in the movement of time. So as we go forward, where are we going with this? I suppose might be an interesting line to take as a value judgment, because I take the point that there's an inevitability about social media. And a certain utility, but I'm just wondering where you think this is going, Emily, in terms of those kind of forms of interaction.
Well, something I was struck by, I was surprised to find an overlap, I found a surprising overlap while I was reading through Paula's book with my own work. And I was thinking about industrialized authenticity is perhaps a form of bad conversation, as Paula discussed it.
Yeah.
Almost similar to the group talk that you talked about. So it's sort of, so when I'm talking about industrialized authenticity in the influencer sense, so I'm kind of talking about how influencers present themselves in these really predictable ways. And that is what they have to do, that in order to, you know, gain and maintain visibility and get paid and all of these things. But that also can become limiting, because then you are, again, you are sort of expected by your audiences and by the advertisers that you work with, to kind of be the same person every day. And influencers often, you know, they are increasingly sort of portraying themselves as community leaders, you know, people that, you know, really being a part of their, you know, community that they're building, rather than viewing themselves as sort of like influencer follower in a more hierarchical relationship. And there's a lot of talk in the influencer space about community and about conversation and interaction, but I can't help but wonder, is this bad conversation, you know, when we are sort of bound by these technological and commercial structures that really shape the way that we present ourselves and the way we interact with each other?
Well,
And
yeah, I just wanted to respond to that. Interrupting is good in conversation,
Yes.
as long as it's not too extreme. But you know, I guess when you call industrialized authenticity, is that commodified authenticity, where you're creating you're doing it in order to, as a means to an end, which is really selling yourself or selling your product, as the case may be. And of course, that's something that I think in good conversation, you don't really necessarily have an end in view. I mean, that when conversation is a means to an end, it's generally not that good, whether it's in an interview process or when you're trying to sell something. I think that is equivalent to what you're talking about in social media, although you're trying to dress it up as though it's authentic and not utilitarian. So there's that tension. But I also wonder, when you made the connection to bad conversation, does it limit people who are on social media a lot from being able to not be on social media and actually speak more authentically outside of the realm in which they've branded themselves? I mean, I would ask you that. Can they exist as real people elsewhere?
Yeah, that is sort of the perennial concern, I think, of a lot of influencers, is navigating those boundaries between their public and private selves, and having to, they really have to feel like they're being authentic online too, you know, like it's impossible to really do the work well if you have to kind of remove yourself and say, okay, I'm at work now. Okay, I need to get to work at constructing my, you know, my authentic self for the public. They really need to feel it within themselves in order to be able to sustain the work. But that comes, you know, with that comes a host of, you know, it's really taxing on them, and so I've seen it start to sort of seep into people's sense of selfhood. And so my research has primarily been on influencers themselves or other professionals working in the space, and not so much on the audience. But that is a sort of concern of my work, is that how much the sort of influencer ethos and that sort of communicating yourself with sort of commercial ends, and communicating yourself, you know, who you are, and, you know, your beliefs and things in a way that you know, plays nice on the on these algorithmically driven platforms, how much that does sort of seep into
Well,
ourselves.
it is very interesting to think that we worry about artificial intelligence and how it's becoming more human, but we need to worry about humans becoming more artificial in the mode that you're talking about. And I was very struck by your reference to there's a static nature to the self as presented on social media. And I see that with my students too, and it's not just social media, but they need to brand themselves. And the idea of branding the self, which is another version of that, where you have certain distinctive elements, I do think that's very limiting to what you can say and do, and very uncreative, ultimately, unimaginative. It so boxes in the self, and it's worrisome.
Yeah, and especially in these situations, like, you know, if you're teaching undergraduates or graduate students and you're in a seminar, or, you know, in these environments that are supposed to be more freewheeling and you know, allow for people to express themselves in various ways, explore different ideas, decide maybe they don't believe that thing they thought they believed after all, that the concept of self-branding just, you know, it just butts right up against that. And it is, I would love to hear if you have any thoughts about how to navigate around that, because I think you see it most sort of maybe acutely in these seminars, especially perhaps in undergraduate seminars, when you're with a group that is really very online and very and has sort of come of age very online in a way that people who are, you know, above age 30 did not. How do we sort of crack that? You know,
well, it's one of the things that makes it harder is that we're a society now that's very polarized, and what you can say or what you could what one might feel you could get in trouble for saying limits not only the professor but the students in the classroom. And so, although I think social media is part of why students are so sometimes static in their responses, I also think they worry that they might say something that would be offensive. And to help with that, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I tread carefully, but I also feel, you know, in my day as a college student, the professor could take a devil's advocate position and could really push the boundaries of what was acceptable to say. And now that doesn't feel right to do. And yet I do think it is the job of a professor to chip away at that surface response. Often one strong-willed student will say something that is generally agreed upon in the culture among right-thinking people or left-thinking people more often, really. And everybody in the class agrees, but that doesn't mean that everyone really agrees. I mean, there are degrees of agreement or disagreement. And one of the things that I say in the book is that what's so interesting about a real conversation with someone else is that you always will disagree to some extent with another person because they're another person. They're not you. And yet, so often the easy way is to mouth platitudes of agreement, which are not fun to hear, and they don't exercise the mind at all, and they don't reflect the distinctiveness of one's humanity. So I think the teacher's job is to try and tease out that distinctiveness from the students and get them to voice at least somewhat their real individual viewpoints, assuming that that does exist somewhere percolating beneath the surface. We may be getting rid of the, you know, when you made the point about public and private, it may be that the private, and this would be Freud's unconscious or whatever you want to call it, you know, Talking Cure is the title of my book. It may be that the private is being wiped clean. In other words, that there is no unconscious anymore. There's just the conscious self and the performative self.
Of course, we would call that context collapse in a Goffman-esque sense, right? And I'm sorry to butt in, but I can't resist any longer and want to take part in this conversation if that's
Please
okay.
do.
So,
Three-way
please.
conversation is
Yes.
good. Yeah.
well, so just to play devil's advocate for a moment, I take the point, and I was going to ask that question, by the way, about the commodification. Why industrialization rather than commodification? Because commodification carries with it a certain selling yourself. But actually, I wonder if there isn't an authenticity to the pursuit of the performance of intimacy. Now, let me just kind of break that down.
Mhm.
So, in other words, there's a clarity of insight. You know, these screens are right in our face. They're recording our backgrounds. They are, in many senses, I wonder if they are more intimate because they are invited into those backspaces, or I love the idea that we're being invited into people's possible unconscious, or that the unconscious doesn't.
Or they're unconscious. They're conscious.
Because frankly, when I talk to students, sometimes the messy dishes, if I think of behind them, if I think of those as the unconscious, that will certainly help in future on a Zoom call. But I'm just wondering if there isn't a hyper intimacy allowed through such manufacturing processes. So I suppose that question is in a sense oriented to you, Emily, in relation to that, in the choice of the term industrial. So I want to push that further and talk about the machinations of intimacy and its representation. But then I wonder if that doesn't counter, Paula, some of your points about, if you like, spaces of intimacy, you know, traditional spaces. And that's a wonderful picture, you know, like the Oxbridge College, and it's always very male and probably very smoky and full of cigar smoke and all those kinds of things. But I just wonder if there isn't an opportunity to transfer some of that, that you know, we can't see those spaces as manufactured intimacies. What do you think? Am I talking rubbish?
No, I'd love to answer, but Emily, you go first about industrial intimacy, authenticity,
Sure.
and then I'll answer his question about spaces.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I turned this over in my head for a long time. Am I talking about commodifying, industrializing? Is it authenticity or is it influence that's being commodified? You know, like kind of turning these ideas around and around for a long time until I settled on it was authenticity that was being industrialized. And the reason that I settled on that term is because the influencer industry, you know, we call it the influencer industry. It is ostensibly about influence. And that is sort of how this all arose 15 or so years ago, when, you know, with the rise of early, you know, bloggers and early digital creators, you know, there was such a hyper fixation on who was influential, who was getting their audience to behave or think in particular ways, and what were the sort of aspects that made them influential. And that was sort of the buzzword of the day. But pretty quickly it became clear that while everyone was using the term influence, what they were really talking about was authenticity, because it all hinged on how real is this person? You know, how much do I believe them? How much do I think that they are being honest and real with me? And also this idea that these creators were, you know, more authentic and more real than, you know, mass media companies, or they were also competing with each other for being, you know, realer than the next person. And so it really was authenticity that was becoming, you know, the sort of central commodity, and the thing that was actually being, you know, actively sought after and actively measured and priced by brands and marketers and the other businesses working in the space. And so that also led to my settling on the term industrial, because it is a sort of coordinated collection, processing, and sale of a good. So it's not just about the individual influencers who are, you know, trying to sell themselves as authentic, tastemakers or experts or what have you, but it's about this constellation of groups and organizations who work together and also compete with each other to collect authenticity sort of en masse and shape it into a product and price it and sell it to each other and foster competition among these people. And so that's how I how I landed on the industrialization of authenticity. And when it comes to, that's a really, I really appreciate your question about, is it actually hyper authenticity or hyper sharing? And I think there is an element to that, because there is, an element of, you are sort of sharing with people aspects of yourself that you may not have shared, without these digital tools and, without this environment that we are now living in. But I do think that because of the current nature of the way we communicate on social media and, the sort of hyper commercialization of it, I do worry that it is sort of providing a sort of superficial version of authenticity or superficial version of intimacy that sort of lacks that spark and that sort of magic that Paula talks about. And that's, again, I'm speaking sort of in broad strokes here. It's not to say that it never happens, and especially for people who live in isolated ways, whether it's geographically or because of their features of their identity or what have you, that connecting with people on Instagram or TikTok in this way can be life-saving and can be world opening for them. But when it comes to authenticity and intimacy, it's sort of on the part of the influencer, it is something that they do have to sort of carefully mine. So while maybe they are sharing more and revealing more, it's something that they have to be really strategic about and really shape as a product before they put it out there. And so to me, it does lose that spontaneity and that we kind of traditionally think of with authenticity, and that spontaneity that goes along with other types of conversation. And there's this whole, and I'll leave it here, but there's also this whole other, the side of sort of being surveilled, which is kind of ties into what Paula was just saying about it, her experiences with undergraduates and in the classroom. But, when performing online, there is this, hyper awareness that you're being watched. And whereas if we think of a conversation with no social media involved, you don't have that limiting factor.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to think about these little squares that we're in and how both artificial but revealing they are. And I think one of the things that needs to be thought about is that, well, I've written a book on silent film, and silent film itself, and in its early years, by being silent, there was a focus on the face that was revolutionary. And the close-up at first seemed very odd to people who were used to seeing the whole body and thought that they were being cheated if they just saw the face. But the idea of looking at someone's face close up is a very intimate thing. But the interesting thing about the internet and what we're doing now is not only am I looking at your faces, but I'm looking at my own face. And that is a very unusual situation. And I don't know exactly what it does to the mind. I think it does something odd, and it may change our whole cognitive system of how we think about things, because not only am I seeing you react to me, I'm seeing me react to you facially, as well as talking. And in close-up, of course, I'm not seeing the whole person. And I'm seeing, what's behind me, which could be very curated. or could not be if there are dirty dishes back there and they, you're living in a very tight situation. So there are a lot of interesting variables involved with social media that can, in some ways, be more intimate, and in other ways be more distancing. I will say that, and I write about it in my book, that I have had this wonderful experience over the 3 years, starting with COVID, of holding a Shakespeare read aloud on Zoom, where we have a group of about 14 people that have been pretty consistent all the way through, who meet, and from all over the country, and actually some from England as well, from the US and England, who we talk about these plays that we read. We read and then we stop and discuss. And as a result of this discussion, we find out about each other, and the age range is from 18 to 80. And it's a group of people that would never otherwise be together, that would probably, even if they were together, wouldn't talk to each other if it weren't for this vehicle of the play that we are using in order to connect. So that's a great boon that we have from being able to do this online, that we would never be able to do in a normal conversation.
Yes. So I suppose, I mean, in some senses, we're worried about substitution, and I mean, maybe we can actually think in terms of extending our notions of intimacy. I'm kind of open to that idea, but I'm interested in this idea of manufacture at the personal level. So Paula, your point about, manufacturing our backdrops, of course, we can make it all fuzzy if we want to, apparently. But I do wonder how much of that we are much more manufacturing. One final question, and we must then look to the Q&A questions that have been posted. I was taken by the idea of a static self. Paula, you mentioned about this seamless presentation of the static self within influencers, and it's just a whimsy. I just wonder if the static self isn't something we need right now. Some certainty, some fixity in a kind of domain of ever changing concatenations of identity as we kind of perform in different directions. So maybe we need the manufacture. Maybe we need some certainties in relation to control of the self that we present to others. What are your thoughts on that? Perhaps, Paula, I can ask you about that.
Yeah, I mean, what does that mean to need it? Maybe that is the sign of a society in deep distress, that we need to have a self that is static. To me, that is not the idea of flux and imagination and change strikes me as what makes us human. And the fact that we can change our minds, we can adjust our thinking, that we can connect to other people that we thought we didn't like or didn't want to know, that is part of being in the world. And when we get static, we get dead, it seems to me. So you're right, though, that it probably has a comforting element to it. But that means the world is so stressful, so difficult and chaotic to deal with, that we need to shut ourselves down, so to speak. That seems to me but to be your suggestion. And maybe that is true in order to maintain our sanity.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be so agreeable, but I do agree with you, Paula, and that is, one of the sort of central conclusions I've come to about the influencer space is the reason it has become so pervasive is because it sort of purports to give us this sense of control in a world that is really chaotic. So many people turn to self-branding on social media as a way of exercising a sense of autonomy over themselves and their lives, and a sense of control over their, creative expression, perhaps control over their financial situation, if they're doing it to seek out money. And in this world that feels like totally out of control a lot of the time, it's not a coincidence that social media and the influencer space, it really exploded in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession. It is not at all coincidental. And I think while many things in our world have changed, this deep sense of uncertainty has not. And so while it's I think there's no question that many people who are really actively, self-branding in particular ways, many people do get some sense of gratification from it. But yeah, it points to why do we need that sense of gratification?
Great, thank you. I mean, I have in mind the Kenneth Gergen, the social psychologist, who talks about the historical move from the bounded self, the sense that the self is, within us, and defining of us, to the relational self, where we're defined in terms of the viewpoint of others and the reflection in others' eyes, in that kind of Kuhlian sense. Thank you very much. I must get to the questions, and for those people, thank you so much for submitting your questions. There are a lot of them, so I am going to have to pick over these a little bit. We've got around 10 minutes because, interestingly, Paula is going to be attending the Shakespeare discussion reading group. I apologize. Immediately after this session. So we will be wrapping up at about 5:02. So we've got about 10 minutes. So please forgive me if I don't pick your question. But Idorenian, apologies for not saying that correctly. The question is this: from both of your opinions, do you actually believe that every conversation, stroke interaction, has to be for the purposes of developing deeper intimacy with someone else? Is it a requirement? Would be my spin on that. Is it intimacy all the way down?
No, I don't think so. I don't think one can expect to have that. I mean, I actually think that, it's the luck of the draw sometimes. You can, often you are involved in a conversation that is very much utilitarian. You need to get something from another person and you're congenial about it, and that's fine. But I think trying to make a connection to somebody is worth trying if you have the time and inclination. I often find myself in certain situations just trying to connect to somebody out of my own need to do so. But that doesn't mean I think that every conversation needs to be deep or have that spark to it. I just think it makes life more interesting the more you can have this with people. And it's a matter of being open to it and being ready to listen or hear the other person, and continue the conversation if you can. The other problem, of course, is we're all so busy. People are so busy rushing here. And in the academic world, it used to be, I write about this, 2-hour lunches. Now people won't have lunch with you anymore. They don't have time. And that, to me, defeats the whole purpose of the academic life, which is to be able to mull things over and make these deep connections. Emily, I don't know if you find it where you are that you would have long lunches with people.
No.
And you have to come over here to Drexel,
yes,
which is not right next door, actually, to the University of Pennsylvania, and have lunch with me.
Yes, okay. I would love that. I would love that. Yes. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and I, that has always been it for me. My whole professional life has been in this world of sort of speed and intensity.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I suppose there were moments in graduate school where we may have been able to chat a bit in the halls or something, but yeah, it's I think a generational difference. And I think the people a generation behind me are even more, you know, kind of in this, even more of a pressure cooker.
Scheduled, you know?
Yes. Because at least I suppose thinking back to maybe perhaps when I was an undergraduate, things were a little bit different. But yeah, in my professional life, it's always been sort of like this. But yeah, I think that sorry, again, I agree with Paula that it's not that every conversation has to be intimate, but I think it is important that every conversation recognize it, you recognize that the other person you're talking to is a person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but yes. Okay. Back to the questions rather than asking my own. I do apologize. So let's just have a look across this. There was a question here about the kind of positive, hang on a minute, let me just find it. I beg your pardon, everybody. So Emma Franklin asks, do you think interactions between influencers and followers can help build self-confidence and community? With, I suppose, in a sense, the kind of valence of this discussion is potentially that, it used to be this way, now it's this way. We've got to somehow deal with that. But I wonder if there are actually kind of pros, there are kind of real opportunities for inclusion, for example. And I think, Paula, you mentioned this in your book, where there are new kind of opportunities for building people's confidence, because it's kind of in private, but consumed in private. So let me just read the whole question through. Do you think interactions between influencers and followers can help build self-confidence and community? As a 35-year-old plus-size woman who works in education, on a personal level, I wish plus-size women had been better represented throughout my teen years, like they now are on social media. So, there's that kind of positive opportunity that wasn't there in the smoky kind of clubs and high tables of universities. See, I'm trying to be provocative. Can you see what I'm trying to do here?
Yeah. Very good. Very good, Dad.
What do you think?
I mean, I absolutely. I think that, like I said before, if you are someone who is, you're able to access something on social media or via an influencer that you can't access in your life, for any range of factors, that you're not accessing in your, day-to-day life, not engaged on social media, then the influencer space, it can be a really wonderful thing. And as a media researcher, looking at the sort of long arc of history of mass media and social media, there's no question that the influencer space has pushed more traditional media outlets to diversify their content. And I think that that's one of the positive sort of consequences of this space has been this opening up of conversations about body size, about race and gender, and the way people are represented in media, and it's sort of, I come originally from the sort of fashion publishing space, and so in that industry especially, there has been they have felt the acute pressure, and there have been changes, not to say everything is perfect, but so yes, if you feel that you can access something, then it can be a source of connection, I think. I think the trouble comes in when people begin to sort of identify with these sort of flat characters that we see in our feeds, and influencers have sort of voiced this to me as well, when they get blowback from their audiences over something they did that the audience perceived to be, outside the brand, or, outside what they were supposed to do. The audience had this expectation of, you're providing me XYZ content. That's what I want from you. Don't talk to me about other things, or how could you reveal that you actually were doing this thing in your life that you didn't share with us, or, what have you. And that's where the trouble comes in, I think, is with this sort of, over identification with a person that you don't fully know. And that doesn't mean that the connection is worthless. It can be very meaningful, but a sort of recognition of the, I guess, boundaries there is important to keep in mind.
It feels like we're coming back to Freud. And those
is
relationships.
This different, do you think, than the way people felt about celebrities in the past? And stars were very curated under the studio system. Certainly now it's less so, but it sounds very similar to that kind of intimacy that people projected onto these public figures.
Yeah, that whole idea of the parasocial relationship, or, feeling that feeling that you're in a relationship with someone who doesn't actually know you back. Right. That is something that has gone on, that predates the digital era for sure. I think the difference now is this sort of the nature of our connections, the fact that we are sort of continually opening up Instagram and TikTok and have this sort of continuous exposure to these people that creates the illusion of a deeper connection with more people than celebrities via that we saw via the movies or the magazine covers.
I agree.
Yeah, there's that history of commodification of intimacy in that sense of buying into particular. We will only have time for one more question. So this is from Claire Sargent in relation to spaces being intimate. So I want to return to that idea of spaces, Paula, that we ventured into earlier. In relation to spaces being intimate, what would you suggest? So we want some positive kind of suggestions here now as good markers to build and identify an intimate space. Is it possible to create these kinds of spaces without them becoming manufactured in themselves? So I would invite both of you in that kind of forward looking. What do we need to do? But maybe wrap that up with how these can become better intimate spaces.
I think that it's interesting how, and I write about this, how young people gravitate toward coffee cafes and coffee houses and so forth, and they sit there with their computers open, working next to each other. I think, they really are eager to connect with each other in these spaces, and these spaces are good enough spaces to connect in if you make that leap across the boundary of this singular table with your computer on it. I think bars and pubs or whatever are wonderful spaces to interact with people, where you sit down and you talk to somebody next to you, or you talk to the bartender. Now you have to, I guess, be indulging a little bit in drink for that. I don't know if this is what this person meant, but I think any space where you can sit and be moderately comfortable is a space where you can engage in intimate conversation. Comfort, I think, is important. You need to be comfortable in order to not have to guard against, revealing too much of yourself or whatever it is. So when you're sitting over drinks or you're sitting over a meal, you can let down your guard a bit and engage with the other person. I think when you're online, I don't know what to say. I guess it's when I think about my group and how intimate we really are, it's because it's built over time. And we do talk to each other online, and generally we're not muted. We don't unmute each time, because that creates a real delay, I think, for people to engage. I don't know how you feel, Emily.
Yes, I mean, I loved that what that moment in your book where you talked about the comfortable chairs in restaurants.
Yes.
They're the
Very
discomfort.
important.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is the
Yeah.
physical comfort in a physical space can make
Yeah.
all the difference. Or, you know, you go to someone's house and they have a really comfortable couch versus, you know, you have to sit on a stool or something
On
like
modernist chairs.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
That physical comfort is huge, I think, and how you and also obviously, and what, you know, when you're interacting online, you could potentially be physically comfortable in your home or
Yeah.
wherever. But I think also that comfort of again, I keep going back to this idea of surveillance or the sense of the stakes being so high when you communicate online because
Yeah.
because you can't take it back. You know, not Zoom is a bit different unless it's
Yeah.
recorded and then it can be clipped and edited and shared
Right.
forever. But in the, you know, in the context of, you know, an unrecorded Zoom call, you do have a little bit of that sense of safety, I suppose. But when you are commenting on social media or posting or what have you, even if you know, rethink what you said and go back and delete whatever you posted, it's, you know, you can't really take it back and you can't really control who may have seen it, who may have saved it, who might have, you know, seen it and made some judgment or mental response to you. And that, you know, you're not really in a conversation with everyone who is seeing what you are putting out there. And then again, this sense of being watched by whether it's the audience or the you know, the algorithms and what they're privileging at a given time. So I think reducing that sort of sense of being watched and that sense of the stakes are very high, I can't say the wrong thing, you know, would go a long way.
Wonderful.
Right.
Well, for the fear of saying the wrong thing, the right thing to say is that we've come to the end of our session. So I just wanted to thank you both for this very personal conversation. I know we're being watched in it, but from my perspective, I can say that I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting you both and listening to you converse with each other and converse with you. I'd just like to thank everybody who's attended this event. The recording, we were just talking about recording, but the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from our Watch Again section of the festival. You will be contacted by email when the video is available to view. If you'd like to purchase a copy of either Paula or Emily's book, they will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. For more information on book sales, please see the festival website or head direct to foxlanebooks.co.uk/Festival of Ideas. And that's pretty much our time. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was so enjoyable. It really was. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.